They tell you when you sign the Maverick contract that space is indifferent, that it does not hate you, does not want you dead, does not feel anything about you at all. I believed that once. I signed on the dotted line, stowed my grief in the overhead compartment, and told myself that indifference was something I could work with. Indifference has rules. Indifference can be calculated, accounted for, survived. What we found out there, past the orbital lanes, past the last relay buoy, past everything charted and named and argued over in committee rooms on Earth, that was not indifference. I know that now. I have known it since the night the Maverick 1 went dark for 47 minutes and then came back online with every clock aboard reading the wrong year. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is what grief does to a man. It pulls him toward the end of the story before he has earned the right to be there. My name is Marco Reyes. Before Maverick, I was a lieutenant in the Joint Aerospace Program, 14 years in, mission qualified on 3 long-haul transits and 1 aborted Mars approach. After Maverick, I was something harder to name. What I will say is this: I went out there looking for my daughter. I came back having found something far larger than 1 missing ship and far more dangerous than empty space. And the men who came back with me, Gray and Mason and the others, they are changed in the same way I am changed, though none of us talks about it in those terms. We use words like incident and anomaly and unexplained signal artifact. We file reports. We sit in debriefing rooms under fluorescent lights and answer questions from people who were never there. But at night, when the room is quiet and the city outside is making its ordinary city sounds, I lie still and I remember what it looked like. The geometry of it, the patience. So let me tell you what actually happened. The Aurora was a NASA colony ship. Class designation Arc 7, crew of 31, civilian passenger complement of 218. Destination: Mars, specifically the Hellas Basin approach, where the International Settlement Consortium had been building infrastructure for 11 years. The Aurora was not the first ship to make that run. It was supposed to be the most ambitious, the largest single-mission colonization attempt in human history, carrying families, engineers, doctors, teachers, seeds, tools, the full human package. My daughter Ariana was on it. She went as a mission astronaut, flight crew, one of 4 people responsible for the Aurora's systems during the transit phase. She was 28 years old. She had her mother's eyes and my stubbornness, and she had been working toward that birth for 6 years. The Aurora went silent at day 41 of the 92-day transit. Not a partial failure, not a degraded signal, not the kind of fault that throws up error codes and gives the ground controllers something to work with. It went silent the way a candle goes out completely, instantaneously, with no warning and no explanation. NASA went through the protocols. They sent queries. They redirected every available antenna. They ran the failure trees. They convened the emergency committees and issued the holding statements and did everything that organizations do when they don't know what happened and are not yet ready to say so publicly. 6 weeks after the Aurora disappeared, they said it publicly. I was in a briefing room at the time, sitting across a table from a NASA liaison named Harmon who had the eyes of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. He told me the Aurora was missing and presumed lost. He told me they had no telemetry, no debris field, no intercept data of any kind. He told me they were deeply sorry. I looked at Harmon for a long moment. Then I asked him when the search and recovery mission was launching. He told me there was no search and recovery mission. I said, then I'll find one. That was how I ended up in a conference room in Sacramento 6 days later, listening to Captain Jack Mason describe what Maverick Aerospace intended to do about the Aurora. Mason was ex-military, private sector for the last 8 years, the kind of man who wore his competence like a coat. You felt it without being told about it. He was direct, and he was organized, and he understood, without my having to explain it, why a lieutenant with 14 years of transit experience, and a missing daughter was exactly the kind of man he needed on his crew. He told me Maverick had a ship. He told me they had a route. He told me this mission was operating outside of NASA's jurisdiction and outside of the Space Force's oversight, which meant it was operating outside of a great many legal frameworks that I did not ask about. I said, "When do we leave?" Commander Gray was already on the manifest when I came aboard. He was older than Mason by a decade, quieter in a way that read as either confidence or damage, depending on the light. I later understood it was both. Gray had history with the deep transit lanes that he did not share freely, something involving his family, something that had started as a personal curiosity and metastasized into a compulsion. He had been tracking anomalies in the Mars corridor for years. Not officially, not with institutional support, but with the persistent, methodical attention of a man who has decided that a particular question will not let him go until he has answered it. I did not fully understand Gray's interest in those early days. I was carrying enough of my own weight. I did not have the capacity to carry his. The Maverick one was a good ship. Not a beautiful ship. Maverick didn't do beautiful. They did functional, hardened, reliable. The kind of ship that would not win prizes at an aerospace show but would get you where you were going and get you home again. She had her name on the nose in white letters that someone had stenciled freehand, slightly uneven, and I always found that detail oddly reassuring. People had built this thing with their hands. People were responsible for it. That accountability had weight. We left Earth orbit on a Tuesday morning. I watched the planet shrink through the observation port until it was a blue disk and then a blue point, and then just a quality of light behind us, and I turned away from it and went to check my instruments. The first 3 weeks were transit routine. Quiet. The kind of quiet that long-haul crews understand. It is not the absence of noise, exactly. It is the compression of time into a particular texture, days that feel both long and featureless, punctuated by shift changes and meal cycles, and the small mechanical ceremonies of keeping a ship functioning. Gray and Mason and I established our rhythms. We talked when talking was warranted. We worked when work needed doing. We slept in our respective intervals and tried not to dream. I dreamed anyway. I dreamed about Ariana at 7 years old, insisting that she understood how rockets worked and would I please stop explaining it wrong. I dreamed about the day she called to tell me she had been accepted for the Aurora mission. The pride in her voice, not the showy kind, the quiet kind, the kind that lives in the chest and only comes out in certain voices, to certain people. I woke from those dreams in the dark and lay still and listened to the Maverick One breathe around me. And I told myself that she was out there somewhere, and that we were going to find her. On day 24, Gray asked me to come look at something. He had been running signal analysis on the transit corridor, cross-checking historical telemetry against the current environment, the kind of background work that takes weeks and produces results that look like noise until they don't. He had a display up in the navigation bay when I arrived, a false color map of the corridor we were tracking through, and he was standing in front of it with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has confirmed a suspicion he was hopping was wrong. He pointed to a region of the map, roughly 200,000 kilometers off our current track, slightly outside the standard transit lane. It was marked in amber on his display. "Signal returns," he said. "Not consistent with any known natural phenomenon in this sector, not consistent with debris, not consistent with communications interference." "What are they consistent with?" I asked. Gray was quiet for a moment. "I've seen returns like this before," he said. "Not here, elsewhere. 3 other locations in the inner system, all of them in the vicinity of transit incidents that were never satisfactorily explained. A cargo hauler that came back 6 weeks late with no crew recollection of the missing time. A survey drone that stopped transmitting and then reappeared 8 months later on a completely different trajectory, functioning normally, with all mission data intact. And the Aurora. The last confirmed telemetry from the Aurora placed it approximately 90 kilometers from the nearest of those returns. I looked at the map for a long time. Then I said, change course. Mason did not like the course change. He was not a man who disliked things loudly. He expressed his objections in the measured, methodical way he expressed everything, with questions and timeline concerns and a careful enumeration of what we did and did not know. He was not wrong about any of it. The amber zone was off charter, outside our approved flight plan, outside the coverage of any emergency response infrastructure. I told him I understood all of that. He asked me if I was making this decision as a crew member or as a father. I told him I was making it as both, and that if he felt that compromised the chain of command, he should relieve me of my post and change course back toward the standard lane. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Helm, adjust bearing to the coordinates Commander Gray is transmitting. Log the change." That was Jack Mason. He had his reasons for being on this ship, his own weight to carry, and I think somewhere in him he had already known that the standard lane was not where we were going to find what we were all looking for. We reached the edge of the amber zone on day 29. The Maverick 1 sensors registered the change before any of us felt it, but the feeling came. It is difficult to describe in terms that will make sense to someone who was not there. It was not quite like entering a physical boundary. There was no line, no visible demarcation, nothing the eye could see. It was more like a pressure change, a subtle shift in the quality of the air aboard the ship, a faint increase in the background hum of the hull sensors that stopped just below the threshold of genuine alarm and stayed there. Gray was at his station reading data. He was very calm. Whatever he had expected, he was not surprised. Mason stood at the main viewport and looked out at a section of space that looked, to the naked eye, like every other section of space we had passed through. Stars, blackness, the distant smear of the galactic arm, nothing that would mark this place as different from any other. I was at my station running systems checks when the Maverick 1's computer spoke. The voice it used was the standard mission AI, Janine, we called her, after the synthesized voice profile. She was not given to editorial commentary. She reported what was in front of her. What she reported, in her steady neutral tone, was this: unidentified structures detected. Bearing 317, range 94,000 kilometers. Configuration does not match any cataloged object class. Recommend visual confirmation. I brought up the sensor display. What I saw there I will try to describe accurately, because accuracy matters, and because I know there are people who will read this account and assume I am exaggerating for effect. They were geometric. That is the first thing to understand. Not organically geometric, not the loose approximate geometry of natural objects like asteroids or ice formations, but precisely, deliberately geometric, equilateral forms and regular intervals and angles that repeated at exact fractions, as though something had decided to demonstrate that it understood mathematics and wanted to be sure we understood that it understood. There were 11 of them, arranged in a pattern that I later spent considerable time trying to name and eventually gave up on. It was not a circle and not a grid, and not any formation I had seen in military or commercial flight operations. It had an internal logic that was apparent. You could see that the arrangement was intentional, but the logic itself was opaque, like reading a sentence in a language that uses your alphabet but none of your words. They were dark, not the dark of unpowered objects, not the flat matte dark of metal or composite in shadow. They absorbed light in a way that made them legible against the starfield only by virtue of what they were not. You could trace their outlines by the stars they occluded, and in that way build up a picture of their shape. Each one was roughly the size of a naval frigate. The arrangement they formed would have enclosed several city blocks. None of them moved. Gray looked at his display for 2 full minutes without speaking. Then he said, quietly, "That's what I've been seeing in the data for 4 years." Mason said, "Are they broadcasting?" "Not on any band I can resolve," Gray said. "They're present. That's all I can tell you. They're present and they're not moving and they are not broadcasting on any human standard frequency. Not human standard, I said. What about other frequencies? Gray looked at me. Their signal in the sub-bands, he said, far below anything we use for communication. Dense, complex. I can't tell you what it is, but it is not random noise. We sat with that for a moment. Mason said, find the aurora. It took us 6 hours. She was there, not in the arrangement, not among the structures, but nearby, holding position in a way that was technically powered but minimally so, as though someone or something had parked her. All running lights off. All external communications inactive. She had the profile of a ship that had been placed somewhere and left. I was on the comm before Mason had finished processing the visual. Aurora, this is Maverick 1 on emergency frequency. Please respond. Aurora, do you copy? Nothing. Aurora, this is Lieutenant Marco Reyes, Maverick Aerospace, broadcasting on all available frequencies. If you are receiving this transmission, please respond by any available means. Gray put a hand on my shoulder, not to stop me, just to be there. I kept calling. On the second hour, the Aurora answered. Not with a voice. With a light, a single navigation running light on the Aurora's port side, blinking in a sequence that was not standard distress protocol but was clearly intentional, clearly coded, clearly sent by a human hand. 3 long, 2 short, 3 long, pause, repeat. That's not SOS, Mason said. No, I said. I was already running the pattern against everything I knew. It's a personal code. I looked at the pattern until my eyes were burning. It's Ariana. She had been 7 years old when she invented it, sitting on the back steps of our house in the evening, playing with a flashlight. She had called it our secret code. I had not thought about it in 20 years. Evidently she had. Mason looked at me. You're certain? I'm certain. Then we go in. I want to be clear about what we did next, because it would be easy to frame it as reckless, and it was not reckless. It was calculated. Mason laid out the approach plan with the same methodical care he brought to everything: minimum velocity, maximum sensor coverage, no active transmissions that might register as provocative to whatever was holding position out there. We did not know what the structures were. We did not know what they wanted or whether they experienced anything analogous to wanting. We knew they had not moved in the 6+ hours we had been observing them. We knew the Aurora was intact. We knew there was a person on that ship using a 20-year-old flashlight code to tell her father she was alive. We closed the distance over 8 hours. The structures did not move. At 30 kilometers, we began to see the Aurora in detail. She was intact. That was the word that kept coming up in my notes from that period. Intact, as though I needed to keep reminding myself of it. No visible hull damage. No debris field. No signs of the catastrophic system's failure that would have been consistent with a sudden communications blackout. She looked like a ship that had been shut down carefully, methodically, by someone who knew what they were doing. At 15 kilometers, 3 of the geometric structures rotated. Not toward us, not away from us. They rotated on axes that bore no obvious relationship to our position or trajectory, a slow quarter turn each, settling into new orientations with the deliberate precision of a mechanism performing a function. Gray tracked them without expression. Mason called out current bearings. I kept my hand near the emergency thrust controls and did not use them. The structures held their new orientations. 15 seconds, 30, a minute. Nothing else happened. Mason said, Janine, record and log all structure movements. Continue approach. We came alongside the Aurora at just over 2 kilometers. At that distance, she was enormous. The Aurora class was built large, designed to carry the weight of human futures, and she filled the viewport the way a mountain fills a valley. She was cold and she was dark and she was the most welcome thing I had ever seen. I put on a suit. Mason put on a suit. We did not have a discussion about this. We both knew that the next step required two people and that Gray needed to stay with the Maverick one. I checked Mason's seals. He checked mine. We went out through the airlock into the black. Spacewalks are always the same and always different. The physical sensation is the same, the stillness, the isolation, the particular quality of your own breathing in the helmet. What changes is everything outside the suit, the context that the suit is moving through, and the context that morning was unlike anything I had suited up into before. The structures were visible from where we floated, 11 dark geometries holding their arrangement against the starfield, and in their presence I was aware of being very small in a way that had nothing to do with the scale of space. It was more specific than that. It was the smallness of being observed by something that has not yet decided what you are. We crossed to the Aurora on suit thrusters, moving slow, moving careful. The exterior airlock was accessible. It cycled normally when I keyed the emergency override, a good sign, an inhabited ship sign, power being managed rather than depleted. We came through the lock and into the ship. The interior was cold and dark and pressurized. Emergency lighting only, red-orange, throwing long shadows down the main corridor. The ship smelled of recycled air and something else beneath it, something I could not name, something that pressed against the back of the throat and stayed there. "Aurora crew," Mason said on the ship's intercom. "Maverick 1 rescue team aboard. Please respond to your nearest intercom station." The intercom crackled, then a voice said, "Dad." I did not say anything for a moment. I could not. "Ariana," I said, "Bay 3. "Bay 3, she said. I found her in the secondary crew quarters, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and a hand lamp in her lap, and the careful, composed expression of someone who has been holding themselves together through force of will for a very long time and is now, with visible effort, continuing to do so. She was thinner. She had a cut on her forehead that had healed badly in the weeks since. She looked at me and I looked at her, and we did not do anything dramatic, because neither of us is built for it. I sat down on the floor next to her, and she leaned against me, and I put my arm around her, and for a little while we stayed like that without speaking. Then she told me what had happened. Day 41. She had been on watch, running routine systems checks, when the Aurora's sensors had registered the structures. Not as nearby objects. At that point they had been much farther out, roughly 800,000 kilometers off the transit lane. The duty officer had logged them as anomalous returns, flagged them for review, and the Aurora's AI had begun tracking them automatically. They moved faster than anything in the Aurora's reference catalog, not accelerating to speed the way a rocket accelerates. They were simply elsewhere, suddenly, in the way that a thought is suddenly somewhere different, without the intervening distance being crossed in any way the sensors could record. One moment they were 800,000 kilometers out. The next moment they were 11 kilometers off the Aurora's bow. The Aurora's crew had approximately 4 minutes between the appearance of the structures and the onset of what Ariana described as a kind of cessation. Not a power failure, not an attack. The lights stayed on, the air stayed pressurized, the instrumentation stayed active, but the people stopped. All 249 of them, at approximately the same moment, sat or lay or stood wherever they were, and became very still and remained that way for a period that Ariana estimated, from the ship's logs, at 31 days. All except Ariana. She did not know why. She had thought about it in the weeks since, turning the question over from every angle, and had not arrived at an explanation she was confident in. She had been in the auxiliary sensor bay when the cessation hit, running a manual diagnostic on a secondary array that had been giving spurious readings. The auxiliary bay was shielded, not heavily, not for any reason related to what happened, just as a standard interference precaution for sensitive equipment. She thought, but was not certain, that the shielding had mattered. For 31 days she had been alone on a ship with 248 people who were alive, breathing, circulating, processing, but entirely unreachable. She had tried everything. She had checked vital signs, which were normal. She had checked brain activity on the medical monitors, which read as profoundly abnormal, patterns unlike sleep or coma or any condition in the medical literature. She had talked to them. She had kept the ship running. She had turned off everything she didn't need to conserve power, and she had rationed her food, and she had kept a log, and she had not lost her mind, which I will tell you was not a given. On day 32, they came back. Not all at once over the course of about 6 hours in what seemed to be a sequence that Ariana could not find a pattern in. Captain and crew first, then passengers, then the medical staff, then the children. When they came back, they were confused and disoriented but physically unharmed, and they had no memory of the intervening time. Not suppressed memory, not fragmentary memory. Nothing. 31 days simply absent from their experience. The Aurora's command team had then spent approximately 3 weeks in a state of controlled paralysis. Not the external kind, the internal kind, the kind that comes from having no framework for what happened to you and no immediate prospect of acquiring one. They could not restart the main drive without understanding why it had shut down. They could not transmit without knowing whether transmitting would trigger a repetition of whatever had happened. They held their position and they waited and they argued and they ran every diagnostic available to them, and they did not die, which was something, but they did not move. Then Ariana had seen the Maverick One on approach and had gone to a viewport with a hand lamp. Mason listened to all of this in the way Mason listened to everything, without interrupting, without visible reaction, just receiving. When she finished, he said, "The structures. Did they interact with the ship at any point after the crew recovered?" 3 times, Ariana said. They would rotate, some of them, not all, in a sequence, then stop. No other detectable activity. Mason looked at Gray on the comm. Gray had been listening. "The rotations we observed on approach," Mason said. "Consistent with what she's describing," Gray said. "Different sequence but same behavioral signature." "What does the sequence mean?" I asked. Silence for a moment. Then Gray said, "I don't know. I have been trying to determine that for 4 years. I have 53 logged instances of these rotation sequences from 6 different locations in the inner system. I have pattern analysis going back 2 years. What I have not been able to determine is the grammar. I can see that there is a language. I cannot read it." I sat with that. The idea that something had been trying to communicate with us repeatedly over years and we had not known, or had not known we didn't know, which was worse. "What do we know?" I said. "We know they don't destroy," Gray said. "Every incident I've documented, the Aurora, the others, the people involved have come back. Changed sometimes, delayed, disoriented, but present. If destruction were the objective, destruction would have occurred." "They're not predators," Mason said. "No," Gray said. "Not predators, something else. Something that looks at us the way you look at something you're trying to understand." The idea settled over the room. Something that looks at us the way you look at something you're trying to understand. I had spent weeks in the transit thinking about what I would feel if I found Ariana alive. I had not thought about what I would feel if I found her alive in circumstances like these, aboard a ship that had been used as a subject of study by entities we could not communicate with and could not fight and could not, it seemed, run from. What I felt when I turned it over and examined it was not fear. It was something more like the sensation of standing at the edge of a significant height, not the terror of falling, but the heightened attention, the awareness that what you do next matters in a way that most things do not. "We need to try," I said. Mason looked at me. "Try what exactly?" "To answer," I said. "They've been sending us something. 31 days with the Aurora, 6 hours with us, 4 years of documented instances. They have been patient. They have waited. Whatever they are, whatever they want, they have not hurt us. That means something." "It could mean many things," Mason said. "None of them necessarily favorable." "It could," I said. "Or it could mean they are waiting for us to be capable of responding, to show them we understand that there's a conversation happening. Ariana was looking at me. In her expression was something I recognized from her childhood, the look she had when she was running a problem and had almost arrived at the answer and was waiting to hear if I had gotten there too. The sequences, she said slowly, the rotations, what if they're not sending information? What if they're asking questions? Gray's voice on the comm was quiet and intent. Go on. When I was alone on the ship, she said, for the first 2 weeks before I understood they weren't going to hurt me, I tried to count the structures. I kept losing track, but one day I got it right. 11. And then I thought, that's a prime number. And I thought about primes for a long time because I had nothing else to think about, and I started wondering if it mattered. 11, Gray said. He was quiet for a moment. The arrangement, the angular spacing. I've been running geometry on it for months. Marco, I need you to look at something. He put it on the main display. It was his false color map from earlier, overlaid now with angle measurements and spacing calculations, a constellation of numbers arranged around the 11 structures. The spacing was not arbitrary. The spacing was mathematically precise, and the sequence of the spacing, when rendered as a series, was a sequence that any secondary school mathematics student would recognize. It was the beginning of the Fibonacci sequence expressed in distance, 1 1 2 3 5 8 13, and so on. They arranged themselves, Gray said, in a pattern that any civilization with access to mathematics would recognize as non-random. They've been sitting there waiting for us to notice. And the rotations, Ariana said, if the rotation angles correspond to sequence positions. They do, Gray said. I can show you the calculations. The last sequence they ran, before we arrived and before the 3 additional rotations, it was the sequence up to position 29. The name of the ship, the number 29. I heard it and the recognition hit me like a physical thing. Centauri 29, I said. Everyone in the room was quiet. It was not our mission designation, Gray said. It was not any official designation I know of, but the number 29 appears in my data going back to the first documented instance, in different forms, in different contexts, in the angular spacing of the original structure arrangement at the first location I identified, in the period of the sub-band signal expressed in hours, 29. They know our mission name, Mason said. Or they gave it to us, Gray said. I don't know which came first. I thought about this for a long time. I thought about something that had been present and patient and mathematically precise, arranging itself in prime configurations and Fibonacci spacings in the transit lanes, reaching toward us in a language built from the things we understood, waiting for us to be ready to hear it. I thought about 31 days in which a ship full of people had been not taken, not damaged, not harmed, examined, witnessed, held very still while something looked very carefully. I thought about Ariana alone in the auxiliary bay with a hand lamp and her father's old flashlight code, doing the same thing they were doing, from the other side of the language barrier, reaching towards something she could not understand with the only thing she had that might translate. We have to answer, I said again. This time Mason did not argue. It took us 4 hours to work out the approach, all of us together, Ariana running the mathematics and Gray correlating against his historical data, and Mason providing the operational framework and me checking everything twice because that was my job, and because I had not come this far to make an error now. The principle was straightforward even if the execution was delicate. We would respond in the same language they had used. Mathematical sequence. Geometric arrangement. We would use the Maverick One's maneuvering thrusters to position the ship at intervals corresponding to the next terms in the sequence they had established. We would, in effect, say, "We hear you. We understand. Here is our response." We would also, in the process, move the Maverick One into a position that Gray's analysis suggested was significant, the position corresponding to term 30 of the sequence, the position after 29. Mason said, "If this triggers another cessation event." "Then we'll wake up eventually," I said. "Same as the Aurora crew, they came back. We don't know that the outcome is always the same." "No," I said, "we don't." He thought about that. Then, "Helm, execute the maneuver sequence as transmitted, log the time and record full sensor data." The Maverick 1 moved. Thrusters firing in the specific increments we had calculated. The ship describing an arc through the dark that was, if you were watching from the right angle with the right mathematics. A sentence in a language that was very old and very patient, and had been waiting for us to speak it. 3 of the structures began to rotate before we reached the final position. Then 5 more. Then all 11. They were doing something different now. Not the partial rotations we had observed before, full axial rotations, slow and synchronized, in a sequence that Gray was reading off the sensors with the concentrated focus of a man trying to hold a complex text in his head. He did not speak for almost 2 minutes. The structures continued to move. Then he said in a quiet and careful voice, "They're responding. The sequence they're generating now, it continues from where we left off. Term 31, term 32. They're extending the sequence." "They're finishing the sentence," Ariana said. "They're doing more than that," Gray said. "Marco, the subband signal, it's changed." I looked at the readout. The subband signal, dense and complex and unresolvable for as long as we'd been observing it, had shifted. Not vanished, shifted. Its character had changed in a way that the sensors couldn't fully quantify but could detect, the way you can tell the difference between static and music even before you can make out the melody. "It's less dense," I said. "It's simpler," Gray said. "Like someone who has been speaking in a very complex register has chosen, deliberately, to simplify, to meet us where we are." We held our position. The structures finished their rotation sequence and held still. The subband signal continued, simpler now, patterned in a way that was still beyond our ability to decode, but was no longer entirely opaque. You could feel the structure in it, the way you can feel the structure of language in a voice even when the words are unknown. Nothing else happened. We stayed there for 7 hours. We watched and we recorded and we broadcast the Fibonacci response 3 more times, in full, and each time the structures answered. Different sequences each time, but consistent in their internal logic, variations on a theme, the way a conversation circles back through the same territory from different angles. On the 4th exchange, one of the structures moved. Not a rotation, a translation, a lateral displacement, carrying it from its position within the arrangement to a new position 3,000 kilometers from the group, directly on the line between the arrangement and the Aurora. Gray watched the data for 2 full minutes. Then he said, "It's marking the path out." Mason looked at him. "The position it's moved to," Gray said. "It's not a blocking position. It's the first step in an exit vector. The arrangement is opening. It's showing the Aurora the way out." Ariana made a sound that I will not try to describe. We spent the next 18 hours working with the Aurora's command team to restart the main drive and plot the exit vector. There were complications. There are always complications, systems that had been in standby too long. A minor fuel line issue that took 3 hours to diagnose. A moment of genuine fear when the drive initially failed to light, and then a moment of relief when it did on the second attempt. Through all of it, the structures held their arrangement with one vacancy, one position open, the path marked. When the Aurora's drive came online and she began to move, I watched through the viewport. The structures moved with her, not following, not pursuing, but maintaining their relationship to the exit vector, adjusting their arrangement slightly each time the Aurora's heading shifted. Like a set of directional markers that reconfigured themselves to keep pointing the way out. It was, I will tell you plainly, one of the most extraordinary things I have ever seen. It was patient and precise and entirely inhuman, and it was, without question, an act of assistance. 2 hours into the Aurora's transit out of the zone, Gray said, "They're withdrawing." One by one, the structures ceased their slow adjustments and became still. Then, over the course of about 40 minutes, they disappeared, not moving away, not accelerating to a distant position. Present and then not present, the stars behind them becoming visible again as though a thought had ended. The subband signal was the last thing to go. It diminished gradually, the pattern becoming simpler and simpler until it was a single tone and then nothing. The Maverick 1 followed the Aurora out of the zone. We were 3 days into the transit home before Mason, and I had a real conversation about it. We were in the galley, the middle of third watch, the ship quiet around us. He had a cup of something that was theoretically coffee, and I had a hand around a water bulb, and we sat across from each other, and there was the particular silence of two people who have been through something, and are trying to find the words. "We didn't find what we were looking for," Mason said finally. "What do you mean?" "I went out there to recover a ship and restore Maverick's operational standing. I recovered the ship, but what I found in the process," he shook his head, "there's no report I can file that accounts for this." "Write what you observed," I said. "File the sensor data. Let the people whose job it is to interpret it interpret it. And when they conclude we're either lying or delusional, then we wait," I said. "They kept coming back to the transit lane for 4 years before we paid attention. Whatever those things are, they're patient. We can afford to be patient." Mason was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you think they knew that you were looking for her specifically?" I thought about this, about the number 29, about the arrangement in the transit lane, about the exit vector opened precisely when the Aurora was ready to move. "I think they know more about us than we know about them," I said. "I think they've known for a long time, and I think that's a very different problem from the one I thought I was going out there to solve." He nodded. We didn't say anything more about it that night. The debriefs when we got home were as Mason had predicted: official skepticism, careful language, repeated requests for corroborating data that we had provided, and that was being analyzed by people who had not been there and who were working, I understood, from a framework that did not easily accommodate what the data described. This is the institutional condition. It is not stupidity and it is not malice. It is the specific difficulty of updating a worldview that has been functional for a long time. I am patient. Gray left Maverick 2 months after we returned. He is pursuing his analysis independently now, correlating the sensor data with the historical records he has been compiling for 4 years, building the picture from the edge inward. He does not publish what he finds, not yet. He sends me occasional notes. They are always more question than answer, which seems right. Ariana is flying again. Different ship, different mission, shorter route. She is the person who knows most precisely what the transition between a standard transit and those 11 presences felt like, and she has chosen to keep flying. I think I understand why. Fear that seeds the ground is a kind of defeat. She did not travel this far to be defeated. Mason is rebuilding Maverick's credibility one successful mission at a time, which is the only way he knows to do things. He calls occasionally. We do not talk about the structures directly. We talk around them the way you talk around a fire that is still burning, acknowledging the warmth and the light without putting your hand in. What I know, sitting here now, in a room with ordinary light and ordinary air, and the ordinary sounds of a city going about its ordinary business. We are not alone in the solar system. We have not been alone. Whatever shares this space with us has been present through the long arc of human spaceflight, present and patient and watching with the same quality of attention that we bring to things we are trying to understand. The way a scientist watches an experiment, the way a father watches a child learning to walk, the way anyone watches anything that they care about getting right. They could have ended us. They were present and capable, and there were moments, the aurora, the cessation, 31 days of unconscious passengers, when ending us would have been available to them as an option. They chose differently. They chose to wait. They chose to open a path when the path was ready to be opened. They chose at the end to make it simpler. I am not sentimental about this. Sentiment is a luxury that the transit lanes do not accommodate, but I will tell you what I believe, as plainly as I can. They are waiting for us to become capable of the conversation they have been trying to have, and we are going to keep going out there. We are going to keep crossing those distances, keep reading those signals, keep arranging ourselves in Fibonacci arcs and responding with everything we know. We are going to keep doing that because that is what we do. That is the thing no cessation event can stop. No incomprehensible mathematics can permanently obscure. No scale of the unknown can finally extinguish. The night Ariana called to tell me she had her birth on the Aurora, I asked her if she was afraid. She said, "Afraid of what specifically?" I said, "Of all of it, the distance, the unknown, what might be out there." She said, "I'm more afraid of staying and never knowing." That is the thing. That is the specifically human thing. We are more afraid of staying and never knowing than we are of the distance and the dark and the patient geometric minds waiting just outside the transit lane, watching to see what we'll do next. The answer they're going to get is the same answer they've always gotten. We're coming. I keep a copy of Ariana's log from those 31 days. Not the official version that went into the mission record, the handwritten one she kept in the back of a maintenance binder, pencil on paper, because she was not going to trust anything digital after what happened. It is 73 pages, and it covers everything from daily life support readings to philosophical speculation to a running record of the structure's observed behaviors to, in several places, what appears to be an attempt to construct a rudimentary communication protocol using materials she had on hand. She got closer than any of us realized at the time. Some of the patterns she identified in the structure movements, intuited, without Gray's data, without any of the analytical tools we had on the Maverick One, are consistent with patterns Gray has since identified in 4 years of archival sensor records. She had no training in this. She had no framework, no precedent, no colleagues to consult. She had 31 days alone on a cold ship and a pencil, and the same stubborn refusal to accept that something is impossible simply because it hasn't been done. I think about that when people tell me we are not ready, when the committees convene and the protocols are debated and the careful, sensible arguments are made for waiting until we know more, understand more, can approach from a position of greater certainty. These are not foolish arguments. In many contexts, they are correct. But the structures in the transit lane have not been waiting for our certainty. They have been waiting for our attention. They have been arranging themselves in patterns legible to any human who bothered to look, broadcasting in sub-bands that our instruments were always capable of detecting, turning and adjusting and opening paths. Doing all of this with the patience of something that has a great deal of time and understands that we do not. We do not have time as a species. We never have. Time is the one resource we cannot expand, cannot manufacture, cannot recover once spent. We have always known this. It is written into everything we do, the urgency under everything, the reason we build ships and cross distances and plant settlements in hostile environments and send our children out into the dark. We know what we are doing when we do it. We are spending time on purpose, deliberately, in the direction of something larger than our own brief individual spans. That is not recklessness, that is the calculation. The first time I sat with Ariana after we brought her home, not the day we found her, not the transit back, but the first time we were in an ordinary room in an ordinary building with coffee and no immediate crisis, she asked me what I thought they wanted. I told her I didn't know. She said, "I think they want to know if we're worth talking to." I asked her what she thought the answer was. She said, "I think we're getting there." I thought about the 31 days she had spent alone on that ship, keeping the systems running, keeping the log, reaching toward the unreachable with whatever was available to her. I thought about Gray spending 4 years assembling a picture that no institution would fund him to assemble. I thought about Mason deciding, in a conference room in Sacramento, that the standard lane was not good enough. I thought about Ariana at 7 years old with a flashlight, inventing a secret code in the evening dark, because she wanted a language that was just ours. And I thought about what the structures had done when we finally reached out in a language they recognized. The simplification, the patient adjustment, the path opened. Something that could end you, choosing not to. Something that could overwhelm you, choosing instead to wait. Something separated from you by a gulf of biology and physics, and the accumulated weight of whatever history it carries, choosing, again and again, to try to bridge it. That is not nothing, that is in fact quite a lot. I do not know what they are. I do not know how long they have been here, watching the inner system, watching the slow arcs of our ambitions outward from the blue world. I do not know what the subband signal contains, or what the precise mathematical grammar of the rotation sequences means when fully decoded. I do not know if they sleep or hunger or grieve or carry any of the weights that make us recognizably ourselves. But I know this, they made themselves legible, with patience and mathematics and the particular effort of reaching across an absolute difference in kind, they made themselves legible to us. They arranged themselves in patterns we could read if we tried. They waited while we failed to try. They waited while we invented our own stories about what might be out there. They waited through the decades of our confident solitude, through all the years when we were certain that the distances were too great and the universe was too empty, and we were alone in the way that feels permanent and final. They waited, and when we finally showed up with our small ship and our grief and our Fibonacci arcs, they answered. I am Marco Reyes. I am a lieutenant, 14 years in transit, one extraordinary mission to my name. I have a daughter who flew into the dark and came back changed and is already planning her next flight. I have colleagues who will spend the rest of their careers on a question that most people have not yet understood is a question. And I have this. The knowledge that somewhere in the transit lanes, patient as mathematics, are 11 geometric minds that have watched us since before we had ships worth watching, and have decided, for reasons I cannot fully fathom and may never fully fathom, that we are worth the wait. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. I have been asked, in the month since we returned, whether I would go back. Whether, knowing what I know, having seen what I saw, I would suit up again and cross those distances and enter that zone where the geometry holds and the sub-band signal fills the instruments and the patience of the unknown presses against the hull. The people who ask this question are asking it in a particular way. They mean, now that the danger is real, do you still choose the dark? Now that you know it is not empty, do you still choose to enter it? It is a reasonable question. It deserves a reasonable answer. Yes, without hesitation, without qualification, without any need to take the question apart or soften what it means. Yes. Not because I am brave, not because I have weighed the probabilities and found them favorable, though I believe they are, but because the alternative, knowing what is out there and choosing not to go, would require a surrender of something I do not know how to surrender. The curiosity, the refusal to accept that the distance is the end of the conversation, the need to go and look and try. We are made of that need. It is not a flaw, it is the engine. Before the mission, before Maverick, before any of this, I used to think about what humanity's defining characteristic was. The thing that, if an alien intelligence were compiling a catalog of species, would stand as the entry for us. I cycled through the usual candidates. Intelligence, but that is not unique. Tool use, but that is not unique. Language, but that is not unique either, not in kind. I think I know now what the entry would say. They go anyway. Told that the distances are too great, they go anyway. Told that the environments are too hostile, they go anyway. Told that the resources are insufficient, the risks are unacceptable, the outcomes are uncertain, they go anyway. They load their families and their seeds and their tools and their grief and their hope and their stubbornness and their carefully invented secret codes onto ships that might not hold. And they go anyway because the alternative is staying. And staying is the one thing they cannot finally bring themselves to do. Something in the transit lane looked at us for years and reached the same conclusion. We are going to be worth talking to. We already are. The Aurora made Mars, 3 months late, battered in ways that will take years to understand and document, carrying 248 people who have 31 days of their lives that they will never recover and will spend the rest of their lives trying to account for. They landed in the Hellas Basin on a Tuesday, under a pink sky, in the dry cold of a world they had crossed the inner system to reach. They planted a flag. They sent a signal. It reached Earth 14 minutes later. I was in a monitoring station when it arrived, sitting next to Gray, both of us listening to the voice of the Aurora's mission commander reading the coordinates and the landing report and the standard arrival protocol, and at the end of it, in a voice that was not quite steady, saying, "We are here. We made it. Tell everyone we made it." Gray did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "They'll come back, to Mars. Now that we have people there, they'll come." I said, "Good." He looked at me. "Let them come," I said. "We'll be ready." He thought about that. Then something shifted in his expression, not a smile exactly, but the thing that precedes a smile, the acknowledgement that something has been resolved. He nodded once slowly and turned back to the console. Outside, the ordinary world continued. People moved through streets. Children memorized the names of planets. Engineers bent over blueprints for the next generation of ships. Somewhere, a young woman was in an aerospace program, 14 months from her first mission, learning to love the numbers the way all of them learned to love the numbers. And in the transit lane, patient as always, present as always, the dark waited for us to come back and try again. We will. We always do. The last entry in Ariana's handwritten log, page 73, is a single line. She told me about it before I read it, so I was not surprised when I reached it. But it hit me the same way it hit her when she wrote it, alone on the cold ship, day 28 of the 31. She wrote, "I think they are lonely too." I have thought about that line more than almost any other thing from those weeks. The presumption of it, the specifically human presumption that loneliness is a condition not limited to us, that something separated from us by every measure of biology and physics and time might nonetheless share in the particular quality of reaching towards something that cannot yet answer. The arrogance, some would say. The projection. But I keep coming back to the evidence. The years, the patience, the mathematical language built from things we would recognize. The subband signal filling the instruments with something too complex for us to read but clearly, structurally, intentionally directed outward. The exit path opened exactly when needed. The simplification at the end, the deliberate choosing of a simpler register, the meeting of us where we were. That is not the behavior of something that does not care whether it is heard. That is the behavior of something that has been trying, in the only ways available to it, to be heard. I think my daughter was right. And I think that somewhere in the long, patient record of the cosmos, whatever records such things, the first exchange of Fibonacci sequences between two radically different minds across the dark of the transit lane counts as a beginning. Small, incomplete. More question than answer, but real, genuine, two different kinds of intelligence looking at each other across the abyss of their difference, choosing to try. That is the story. That is what happened, as plainly as I can tell it. The rest is what happens next. And what happens next is, we go.